And it was just one of my favorite surfing spots on the whole coast. And all of a sudden, I find all these people I know have houses there.
Donald Sutherland was an old lover of mine from Canada. He told me about this house on Nicholas Beach that was $400 a month, I think. It was a great house right on the beach with 2 bedrooms upstairs and in that hideous 60s A-line split-level style with an avocado green shag rug that was about that deep.
It was very beautiful and very free out there. The ocean was incredible. We were right on these beautiful dunes on a private road, and Michael and Julia Phillips rented a house down the beach.
Julia and Michael Phillips had just produced their first hit, The Sting, for Universal.
We met as neighbors and became very good friends and became, I guess, co-conspirators in a sense, unconscious co-conspirators, in that we began to mix our friends and relationships on a social level, but it became an important career thing.
We were quite arrogant, Jenny and I, about being the queen bees who decided who was in and who was out in this peculiar little rapidly growing crowd of misfits. Jenny was friends with Brian De Palma, who I promptly got a crush on.
They became an item, and he brought Marty out. Marty Scorsese, who brought Harvey Keitel out.
This odd friend of his, Harvey Keitel, who seemed to come with Marty in those days. You didn't get one without the other.
And like Schrader was there.
Marty had or Brian had another place, and Michael and Julia Phillips had another place, and somehow between the 3 places, people would run into each other.
I think Milius, did he know Brian, or did he know Margie?
Who first brought Bobby De Niro out? Who first brought Al Pacino out? That's easy. He was going out with Jill.
And Margie brought home her darling little friend, Steven Spielberg.
A bunch of actors, you know, lots of girls. I'm telling you, life was good.
Steven certainly wasn't a ladies' man, and Marty wasn't, and Paul Schrader wasn't. I think these were just like, the truth is, on some level, they were nerdy guys who wanted to hang out with each other and talk movies and make movies.
There was a chemistry going on between all these people having a chance to meet each other and talk and hang out.
Well, Julia Phillips, she pulled everybody together. And of course, she wanted to exploit everybody. But she actually had a very positive effect because she was full of enthusiasm. What movie do you want to do? Let's see if we can get this done.
We all really rooted for each other in every way, shape, and form. Went to each other's screenings, read each other's screenplays, offered suggestions, offered suggestions about each other's love life. It was all in the pod and up for grabs, and very much a communal experience.
Nicholas Beach, with its rabid film buff culture, would create both competition and inspiration. Imagine De Palma, Spielberg, Schrader, Milius, Scorsese, all arguing and fighting over movies, favorite directors, and possible projects. Ultimately, they drove each other to think and believe they could make great films.
Run, Bertha!
The young Scorsese at that point had only directed the Corman-produced Boxcar Bertha. He would prove his talent to his buddies on the beach with a film from the streets.
The characters in Mean Streets are a compilation of many characters in the neighborhood where I used to live, but he lived there all his life.
Jonathan Taplin was a rock and roll refugee from the band who decided to check out the movie business.
I was kind of arrogant enough. I didn't know what I didn't know. And so I figured if I could have produced, 300 rock and roll concerts the last 4 years, why couldn't I produce a movie? So I put some of my own money, and I put a couple of my friends' money, and we got together $500,000 of friends. And they loved the picture. They just totally loved it. They saw its originality.
I remember the first executive we showed it to, we shall remain nameless. He said after a few minutes, he got up and he said, listen, gentlemen, thanks for bringing it, but this is not gonna work. So he walked out.
And so Marty's like dying. I'm like thinking, oh, gee, maybe I put my life savings into something that I'll never get it back. And then we came here to Warner Brothers, and the movie starts, and about 10 minutes in the movie, this waiter arrives. Who's got the tuna on rye? And Marty's just like, again, dying. This guy is standing right in the middle of the screen, the projector projecting the waiter on the screen. And eventually it settles down, and they're beginning to laugh, because these are New York guys. They understand that kind of Catholic, Jewish, weird New York humor. And I'm beginning to think, wow, this is going to be okay. And then about 2/3 of the way through the movie, John Calley was sitting way up front, gets up and starts to walk back. And I thought, oh my God, this is disastrous. He's leaving. And he comes and he sits down next to me and says, this is the best movie I've seen all year, but I have to take a leak. Would you mind stopping it for a minute? And I said, sure, what button do I push? You know, and so we stopped. He went out and came back. We finished the movie, and he just got up and he said, we're buying it. You know, well, I don't want you to sell it to anybody else but us. And so that was like, all of a sudden we were up. Marty popped 2 Valiums. He was fine. And about 3 weeks later, we had a meeting with Jay Cox and Marty and Bob Evans. And he was saying, why didn't you guys sell this movie to us? we had to rat on Peter Bart.
Mean Streets opened to ecstatic critical reviews. In an era when reviews really made a difference.
Well, obviously it was a different time, but there was a sense that film criticism was part of the movement, and that that film critics were there at the barricades, with the sort of political message of Godard and Weekend and La Chinoise, and it seems rather preposterous today to think of a film critic as part of a political movement, but clearly that's how a lot of us thought of ourselves.
But even as the critics helped bring audiences back into the theaters, the studios were beginning to understand what kind of film could really bring in the dollars.
It opened in New York, and it did very well in New York, but then literally in the 5th or 6th week that they'd been working it, The Exorcist came out, and that just kind of sucked up all the Warner Brothers oxygen, and that was it. That's where they were going to take their energies.
With The Exorcist, Warner Brothers duplicated Paramount's Godfather strategy, opening the picture all over the country on hundreds of screens. The Exorcist was Billy Friedkin's second hit after the hugely successful French Connection, and he joined the growing list of directors who could do no wrong. Hollywood now belonged to the auteurs. Eagerly grabbing up these new media stars, Paramount's Charlie Bluhdorn set up the Directors Company with William Friedkin, Francis Coppola, and Peter Bogdanovich, ignoring growing industry concern about inflated directorial egos.
It was a signal to the industry that the producer could be pushed off to the side, and the directors were the people that would be charged with the responsibility of making the picture. Nobody ever suggested the director wasn't the director of the movie, but then nobody should complain when you give him 100% freedom about why the pictures are costing so much or why they're not talking to the studio. And I think that was a terrible mistake.
Coppola's first film for the newly formed company was The Conversation, a small, artful film that took a long time to recoup its relatively small budget.
Oh, really? I didn't mean to tell you on that level. No, I understand.
Bogdanovich folded his already shooting Paper Moon into the new company.
What company you say you're from?
But then stumbled with his follow-up picture, Daisy Miller. After viewing Daisy Miller and The Conversation, however, Bert Schneider and Bob Rafelson had continued BBS's successful run of films with Rafelson's 5 Easy Pieces. But Bert, having conquered Hollywood, was turning his attention away from make-believe.
Bert felt the need, in the expression, the colloquialism, to put his money where his mouth was. He believed in certain things and he supported them. Bert's involvements with with other non-filmic things, such as Huey Newton and the Black Panthers, such as Abby Hoffman, who Burt supported while he was underground.
Huey Newton would be at those parties. You know, I don't know a lot of the specifics, but sort of legend has it that he got some guns to the Panthers.
In 1974, Burt would produce the Academy Award-winning documentary on the Vietnam War, Hearts and Minds. Accepting his Oscar, Schneider would read a telegram conveying greetings of friendship to all American people from Vietnam's revolutionary government. There was a moment of shocked silence before a burst of applause and scattered hisses. Meanwhile, Sam Peckinpah was continuing his politically incorrect ways. After scoring with the violent Wild Bunch, he had alienated women with the sexist Straw Dogs.
Sam was like a dog that you love, but he's always doing something that kind of embarrasses you, you know.
I don't even think Sam would be allowed to get into L.A., much less work in L.A. He was a total outlaw, and he was one of the last of a breed. He was like one of the Wild Bunch, you know.
But there was clearly a case of a real survivor. I mean, Sam had the mentality. He was like, he couldn't really create until he was face down in the barroom, dead broke, with everyone standing around laughing at him.
Dylan came to see me, and by that time we had cast Christopherson. He said, you know, I got to tell you that in a past life I was Billy the Kid. So I said, well, that's great, you know, Bob, that's what you're in, you know. So 2 weeks later we flew down to Durango together, and we went to see Sam. It was like late at night. Sam lived on kind of outside of town, and we walked up towards the house, and there was this scream out of the house, and this maid ran out just terrified, and we heard a shot, and didn't say anything. He had a bottle in one hand and a gun in the other, and I said, Sam, this is Bob Dylan.
In the end, Dylan's soundtrack would make more money than Peckinpah's film.
He was trying to make something good. Unfortunately, it was so much creative energy I felt was expended in fighting the guys who were supposed to be on his side, you know, the studio or the producers or whatever.
As the alcoholic Peckinpah fought MGM over his director's cut, a rising star gave one of the boys from Malibu his first studio gig. Ellen Burstyn had just become a big star in Warner Brothers' The Exorcist when the studio offered her a picture where she could pick the director.
So I called Francis Coppola. And I asked him, do you know anybody new and exciting? And he said, well, look at a film called Mean Streets. Marty came in, and I said, you know, I loved your movie, but it's really all about men, and this one picture is from a woman's point of view, and I can't tell from that movie if you know anything about women at all, do you? And he said, no, but I'd like to learn. So I thought that was as good an answer as I could ever imagine.
Scorsese decided to surround himself with women for Alice, partially to help him artistically and partially to protect himself. Scorsese made his girlfriend Sandy Weintraub the film's associate producer, then hired Toby Rafelson, who had recently split from husband Bob after he'd become far too open about his numerous sexual infidelities. And finally, George Lucas's wife Marcia came on as editor.
Got him! That's okay, boy! That's okay, you run! Alice, if you...
But in Hollywood, the only relationships that seemed to last were between men. At Paramount, Bob Evans and pals Roman Polanski, Jack Nicholson, and Robert Towne were creating a classic noir tale of 1930s Los Angeles, a film made even darker when Polanski, still carrying the scars of his wife's murder, insisted on changing Towne's script to reflect what he saw as reality. Faye Dunaway's character is murdered, and her daughter returned to her incestual father. Chinatown's artistic success would justify the studio's faith in the director as auteur. By the middle of the 70s, audiences had returned to the movie theaters. Films like The Godfather, American Graffiti, and The Exorcist were packing them in. A new generation of directors, like Coppola, Bogdanovich, Hopper, Penn, Peckinpah, Scorsese, and Altman, had made movies relevant again, with handcrafted films that spoke to modern audiences. But now that the studios had those audiences back, did they really have to deal with the huge egos and autocratic control that these directors demanded? Before the studio heads could even articulate this question, the first cracks were already appearing in this Arturist utopia.
Trouble is, the studios, when they think you're infallible, suddenly you're fallible, you make a mistake, you screw up, they lose some money, then they get nervous about the next one.
Peter Bogdanovich stumbled badly with At Long Last Love and Daisy Miller. Dennis Hopper's career was temporarily lost in a snowstorm of drugs and paranoia. And now that BBS had essentially shut down, Bob Rafelson watched his directorial ambitions collapse under the weight of The King of Marvin Gardens and Stay Hungry. And Robert Altman, after 4 commercial flops, adroitly sidestepped studio indifference to Nashville by involving critic Pauline Kael early on in editing. Her fierce endorsement helped turn the film into the last commercial success Altman would enjoy for many years.
What happened to the directors like Peter, like Altman, like Peckinpah? These guys were doing whatever they wanted, and they were smoking dope, and they were drinking, and, they lost their minds. I really think that's what happened, It was the age of excess.
We didn't know enough. We were too successful. We probably were somewhat arrogant. I speak for a lot of us. And we made some mistakes, made big mistakes.
As the directors started stumbling, star Warren...
Obviously, because he was co-writing it and co-producing, and actually it was his baby.
Hal was frustrated by it on a certain level because, like most directors, he wanted to be in charge. And I don't think he was in charge on that particular film.
Warren is a very unique person, too. And he is so strong, He's, whatever he has in mind, one way or another, he's going to get it. So here was the situation between him and Hal, who's also equally very strong. So he said, okay, he says, we're going to do my takes first. And, we did 8 or 10 takes. And Hal says, okay, I'm happy now, let's do, whatever.
And hey, it was Hal's most successful film. So what do you say?
Shampoo was so successful, it momentarily gave Ashby the clout to make his next picture without stars. Bound for Glory was a biography of singer Woody Guthrie and his attempts to help organize poor and disenfranchised workers into unions. Ashby, like the artist in his film, was uncompromising, and the picture soon went far over budget and, worse, failed to connect with an audience. The public's taste was changing, and it would be fed by one of the movie nerds from Malibu.
He did know what was going on at the studios. He was the wonderkind. I think he dropped a year off his age somewhere there, or a couple, I think. I'm sure he did. Because he started out older than me.
Steven Spielberg had become a Universal contract director in television, and then had risen out of that ghetto with the TV movie Duel. He was 28 years old when he started the movie that would change him and the movie business forever.
I saw him become a huge character. The demands that were and pressures that were thrown at him that were staggeringly difficult and painful, and he rose. He just did it. He did his job.
Well, for a writer, it wasn't too tough, except that I was writing, a few days ahead of the schedule, and I shared a house with Steven, so we would talk about nothing but the film. Luckily, I didn't have to go on the water for the last 2 months when Steven, Roy, and Ricky were going out every day with Robert and the crew to get maybe 30 seconds of usable film.
Bad weather, ships on the horizon, and a recalcitrant mechanical shark soon drove the picture wildly over budget and dangerously behind schedule. 2/3 of the way through the shoot, the studio flew out to see for themselves why the picture was in trouble. They were met by a director who didn't smoke, didn't drink, and was willing to set aside his own ego when dealing with studio executives. The result? The Universal suits went back to Hollywood, and Spielberg finished his film.
I left the shoot like on a Wednesday, whatever. We were wrapped. After 6 months, we were wrapping. But we still had a couple of more shots to go, including the shot which exploded the shark. Roy Scheider goes, bam, and the shark. It's a pretty involved and intricate shot. And so I had flown to Boston. And then I met Stephen in Boston and got on the plane with him to L.A. And I said, so how did the shot go? And he said, they're doing it now. I said, well, why aren't you there? And he kind of gave me this insane grin, and he had bailed. He just said, I can't do this, you know. And he had put that shot in the hands of his AD, and he had skipped, which was his way of going totally and completely insane.
While Spielberg and editor Verna Fields started to assemble the shark movie, some of the other filmmakers from Malibu were slipping a dark nightmare through the studio gates.
Well, I had gone to UCLA Film School. I'd gone to the AFI. I was the fellow the very first year it began, when it was all free. And then a number of things had fallen apart in my life. I was in debt. I wasn't making any money. Marriage had fallen apart. I had left the AFI in protest over some of their policies. So I really didn't have much of a place to go or much of a life. I took to wandering and kind of drifting around. And it was out of that period of drifting and drinking that I started having this pain, and finally went to the hospital, and I had an ulcer, 26 years old. And I realized in the emergency area that I hadn't spoken to anybody in weeks. I'd just been drifting around in this car, you know, sleeping in my car.
De Niro. In Bang the Drum Slowly, the critics called him a brilliant new talent. After Mean Streets, they said he was a genius. For his performance in The Godfather Part 2, they gave him the Academy Award.
Come on, man. Just get me out of here, all right?
Now, Robert De Niro creates a terrifying portrait of life on the edge of madness.
Tabby, just forget about this. It's nothing.
Taxi Driver, a film by Martin Scorsese.
Yeah, people do anything in front of a taxi driver. I mean, anything. People too cheap to rent a hotel room.
Oh, driver, hurry up, will you?
People want to embarrass you. It's like you're not even there. It's like, you know, like a taxi driver doesn't even exist.
This city here is like an open sewer, you know? It's full of filth and scum.
I think I know what you mean, Travis.
It was one of those scripts that banged around Hollywood, and everyone said, gee, this is really a good script. Somebody should make it, but of course not us. And then things started coming together. Michael and Julia got a Best Oscar for The Sting. Marty had a hit with Alice Doesn't Live Here. Bobby got an Oscar for Godfather 2. And all of a sudden, at $2 million, Beagleman and Julia Phillips were friends, and Julia said, you know, everybody says somebody should make this. Why don't you make it? And he's finally just said, why not? Okay.
Scorsese was very nervous. He was had every kind of asthma condition. He was, you know, just afraid of being chewed up by the system. He'd obviously been banged around in some of his filmmaking experiences and just wanted to get through with his work without being too badly mauled.
In order to get a green light from the studio, Phillips and Scorsese went forward with what they knew would be an inadequate budget.
We were the Enron of Columbia Pictures at that time. We kept the truth hidden. We made promises, and then we'd go out and shoot something we'd say we were going to drop, and they would freak out. You were supposed to drop this. You're not authorized to shoot it. You know, sorry. It wasn't. You know, it's okay. We thought we could do it on the same day. You know, they're just playing a role.
For Taxi Driver, the boys from Malibu Beach closed ranks protectively around Scorsese. Sybil Shepherd was practically visiting royalty.
She came in because the studio wanted one more name in the cast.
At the time, I had 2 offers at Columbia Pictures. I had Taxi Driver and I had Nickelodeon. And David Beagleman said I couldn't do both. And I talked to Peter, and we both agreed. I said, I need to do Taxi Driver because we were no longer reviewed for our work after At Long Last Love, Peter and I. We were so obnoxious in the press, you know. Look at us, like, we're in love and we don't have to be married. I mean, that was a revolutionary premise in those times. You know, we were the first couple to ever be on the cover of a magazine that were living together in sin.
Her partner's film, Nickelodeon, would make money for Columbia Pictures, but not enough to reverse the perception that Bogdanovich had lost his touch. And in a business where perception is everything, Steven Spielberg's shark film was about to change Hollywood's perception of what success really meant.
Had I seen it? No, I guess I hadn't seen it yet. I was in New York, and the studio told me that the film was going to be shown at the Rivoli Theater on such and such a night, and so I go down to the Rivoli Theater, and there's 1,500 or 2,000 people there. So we start watching this movie. Now, I'm in the movie, and I forgot that I was in it. I was so swept up in the fear and the storytelling, and I completely forgot that that was me. I had no idea. I was appropriately terrified and scared, and it was incredible. And then the audience did something that I had never heard, ever. And maybe it had been done before, but the movie ends, and the entire building erupts in a sound that was extraordinary. Screaming, yelling, applauding, yelling, screaming, Gewalt!
That's a 20-footer.
25. 3 tons on them.
You're gonna need a bigger boat, right?
Gotta get to work.
Well, how do we handle this? How do we handle this?
Hold for it, Martin. I need you. He's circling the boat, Martin. Come on, come on.
Lou Wasserman, Sid Sheinberg, Henry H. Hyatt Martin, and Charlie Powell, who were, Martin was head of distribution, Powell was head of marketing and publicity, met in the men's room of the theater, because it was the only place where they could talk. And Wasserman said, put it out in 12, as many screens as we can get. And they went for 1,200 screens, which was at that time unheard of.
This was a big decision to try to take Jaws and put it out there like they used to do with exploitation pictures. Well, exploitation pictures were meant to come in, make a lot of money before anybody noticed how bad they were, and get out.
When I saw Jaws, I thought, uh-oh, these guys understand what I and my contemporaries are doing, and they have the...
Cocaine and amphetamines way before the success, and in fact had quite a bit of success, you know, working behind it. And in fact, I was thinking yesterday, you know, things I might say about it, and there was a definite progression that went from using it as a tool to using it as a crutch, and then it became, you weren't using it for anything except that it was life itself.
In the new Hollywood, Julia Phillips was just one of the legion of movie professionals for whom cocaine was a perk and a tool.
When I was directing Blue Collar and I was in pre-production, the producer at that time, Harold Snyder, actually came into my office about 7 o'clock at night, put a vial on my desk and said, here, this will help you work longer. You know, and it was, you know, almost medicinal.
There was a time in Hollywood where you could actually see people snorting coke in public. And you could see people snorting coke in public who you knew, I mean, who were like, you know, they had authority, they had responsibility. Now you know, at that time I was like completely over my head.
We went to an AFI tribute for Alfred Hitchcock one year during this period. And I went to the men's room, and I swear to God, under every single stall there was at least 6 or 8 legs. The sound of snorting was so loud that it was just like a joke. And there was this one kind of old washroom attendant sitting there trying to hand out towels. And it was comical. And here's old Alfred Hitchcock up there getting his Life Achievement Award, and all the Hollywood Teufel were in there snorting cocaine. It reflects the unique state of mind that Marty was in at that time. He was having a terrible trouble with his marriage with Julia. He was having an affair with Liza Minnelli. He was staying up all night. He had pushed it to the edge of the envelope.
The private life is kind of screwed up, so you begin to live in the fast lane because you want to kind of get some benefit out of where you are, but you can't because your work is always, they're always in the back of your head with a gun, you know? They paid you, deliver, you know?
All this emotional chaos and everybody doing too much cocaine didn't help solve the artistic problems.
Marty was very clever that we started with the musical numbers. So 2 weeks, that's all we shot. When we finished, he invited for screening Vincent Minnelli, everybody. I mean, it's just a big gala, it was a rap party, you know. And they showed this, I don't know, it was about 15, 20 minutes musical number. And it was, you know, I was even surprised. It was fabulous, you know. It was moving and all great song. And from that point on, the studio, you know, gave Marty anything.
You know, I didn't know that, you know, that this was kind of drugs or us going on this movie. You know, I wasn't, at the time, I never tried drugs, so I didn't know what it smelled like, looked like, or what people were like when they were on it.
Ultimately, Scorsese kicked the drugs and recovered. Some didn't. In the deserts of Nevada, Sam Peckinpah was driving Convoy off the road.
Cocaine and booze was a big problem. And that would certainly explain a lot of the delays. I was on the wagon then, and Sam wasn't. And I would stay pretty much in my trailer. I didn't want to get out and get in trouble. And they actually fired him at one point. And I told him that I would walk if he weren't kept on the film. We were standing outside the saloon where the truck stop where the fight was, and he came up behind me and says, "You son of a bitch, I was out of here." And I said, "Well, you son of a bitch, you got me into here, you know." He was in rough shape.
Time and time again, he would ruin himself financially. He'd ruin his personal life. He'd ruin his reputation. And then, so he could do this whole Phoenix act. It didn't work with cocaine. He did fall flat down face down on the floor again with cocaine. Only this time he couldn't get up. A different drug, you know.
William Blake said the road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. It also leads to the grave, you know.
Sam Peckinpah made one more picture, the compromised Osterman Weekend, before dying of heart failure at the age of 59 in Mexico. Most said he was the victim of his own excesses.
People can always say you're your own victim, but there are times that people have great talent, and that talent has to be nourished in some way. And if this industry can't nourish it, then they become victims, and then their self-indulgence sometimes takes over, and nobody pulls them up and pulls them out. I mean, if you write screenplay after screenplay after screenplay, or deal after deal after deal that you see fall apart and go away and so on, and you never lose your enthusiasm for wanting to make film, you're a victim. That's all.
Malibu resident producer provocateur Julia Phillips would finally drive the drug scene underground when she publicly flamed out on Steven Spielberg's high-profile follow-up to Jaws, Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Julia and I were pretty terrible. But as far as I was concerned, in the midst of Julia's Hazarai craziness, Gewalt, she also was a hard worker.
Julia fought the battles on this. We were divorced at this time, and She ran into problems, as everybody knows, late in the post-production and drug problems, and had to be removed, and I got back on and worked with Stephen to finish the film.
Some years later, she wrote a book. So I go to the bookstore. I'm reading what Julia is writing about me, and I am getting seriously angry, seriously furious, and I'm gonna kill her, and I'm gonna do this, and I'm gonna do that. And all of a sudden, I hear this little voice, and the voice inside my head is saying, Richard, what really happened was so much worse. Leave it alone. And I left it alone. I didn't know Julia in the last few years of her life. No, I don't know. She wasn't happy. She wasn't in good circumstances. But I never hated her for that. I just, I was there. I did that stuff.
Drugs and excess may have derailed some of Hollywood's new generation, but it was nothing compared to the growing success of the easily promotable B-movies that audiences were embracing. But this was a new kind of B-movie. Instead of a low-budget programmer to fit the bottom of a double bill, these films were expensive, special effects-driven pictures like Close Encounters that could endanger a studio if they failed. Over in England and in computer labs in California, George Lucas was quietly laboring on the ultimate B-movie.
So George got, from American Graffiti, he got to make a $13 million movie, which was a huge budget in those days. It was giant. And I remember he called and he said, I don't know if it's going to work at Fox. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, they're not going to give me the rights to any sequels. And I said, George, sequels? You're lucky to get $13 million for this movie, He said, no, I want to control it, and I want the sequels and so forth. And he held firm, and he ended up owning the rights to Star Wars.
And he said, I'm gonna make more money by making science fiction toys. I'm gonna make more money than even The Godfather by making science fiction toys. And he hated directing, George did, because he got sick all the time. He had diabetes, and he just wasn't very sturdy. And he got sick. And he always would talk, he would say, porno, that's the answer. He says, it's a warm room. If you don't get the right location, you go get another. I mean, people really don't care what room, as long as it's a pretty nice room. So if he hadn't done Star Wars or American Graffiti, he would probably own this huge porno network today. He'd probably be even richer than he is.
At the first rough-cut screening of Star Wars, the directorial division of opinion would foretell the future of movies.
George called his friends and said, I want everybody to see a rough cut of Star Wars. And it was hard to watch because it was, the special effects, nothing was there yet.
So what we saw was very crude World War II footage where the effects would be. And even for experienced people, it takes a lot to look at a rough cut. And
Brian De Palma was particularly sarcastic and, what's this crap about the Force, what is the Force of others, but George listened and he took it sort of good-naturedly, and the only one who was really optimistic was Spielberg. He said, I think it's great. It's going to, it's going to make $100 million, and we thought, well, Steve's just Steve, sort of energetic kid. Once he started screening it again, it was like American Graffiti, the audiences just went nuts.
Hollywood, California, August 1977. A triumphant moment in screen history. To the world-famous Chinese theater come the stars of the biggest box office success in motion picture history.
The financial success of Star Wars would, with The Exorcist, Jaws, and Close Encounters, essentially end the epoch of the director-driven film and begin the era of the big-budget B-movie, where the studios could open a film everywhere with nationwide ad campaigns and fast playoffs. it almost didn't matter if the film was good or not, just as long as it made a great trailer.
Thousands are gathered to see the metallic megastars place their footprints in cement in the theater's courtyard. As the two heroes of Star Wars make their indelible impressions on the ground reserved for Movieland's legends, the world resounds with the fact that Star Wars itself has become a full-fledged social phenomenon. It has become more than just a movie.
Star Wars was the ultimate triumph of the B-movie. It had taken little more than a decade for the studios to regain their dominance and find their new audience with slick, effects-driven sci-fi horror films, ironic superheroes, and sequels. Endless sequels.
The era of the director, brief era of the director, came to a conclusion in really certainly by the end of the 70s, if not sooner. It was sort of petering out.
They started figuring out the mechanism of what was making money, and so that they wouldn't be in this horrible position of having filmmakers walk in the door and say, you don't know what makes money, I do, I'll make the movie. So finally, after about 10 years, they were able to say, yes, we do know what makes money, and you will make it for us.
I mean, the system allowed these artists to create, and then after a while, when it became essentially conglomerates took over the studios, everything changed.
I think the thing that killed, for me, movies more than anything was the event of Entertainment Tonight, when they started doing box office scores, like football scores. And I remember seeing it the first weekend that they did it, or the first Monday, that this film had come in first and this second, and I looked at that screen and I said, we're over.
In 1979, director Marty Scorsese, exhausted and convinced his career was over, decided to leave Hollywood. But, urged on by Robert De Niro, Scorsese summoned up one last primal scream of defiance.
These are clean, whistling shots. How he can survive them, nobody knows. No man can endure this pummeling. The fight is stopped on the signal to Frankie Secora. Row after row after row from the ring, the crowd is standing and cheering as he just cannonaded Jake LaMotta into a death defeat. And when I say that, I mean Jake wouldn't want to quit. He wanted to go.
Hey, Ray. Never went down, Ray. You never got me down, Ray. You hear me? Never got me down. Yeah? See?
And in the 13th round, the